There are moments on television when a simple interview suddenly becomes something much bigger. A guest walks in expecting questions. The host expects answers. The audience expects a little laughter, a little promotion, and then the next segment. But sometimes one question changes everything. Imagine Adam Sandler sitting across from Behar, expecting an ordinary conversation about his career, his movies, and the kind of comedy that made millions of people laugh. Sandler has spent decades being criticized, celebrated, underestimated, and occasionally dismissed by people who never understood why his particular brand of humor connected with so many ordinary viewers. Then comes the question. Not a question about his latest project. Not a question about his creative process. A question that appears designed to make him defend his entire career. At first, Sandler doesn't fight back. He stays calm. He smiles. He answers carefully. But the criticism keeps coming. His comedy is questioned. His dramatic work is questioned. Even the value of making people laugh is put on trial. And that's when something changes. Because there's a difference between criticizing someone's work and making that person feel as though everything they've created has no value. Sandler can take a joke. He can take a bad review. He can even take people saying they don't like his movies. But when the conversation crosses into something deeper, when someone begins attacking the meaning behind his life's work, staying silent becomes much harder. What follows is a confrontation built around one powerful question. What happens when someone who has spent his entire career making other people laugh finally decides that he's done being the punchline? And the answer isn't what anyone would expect. Because Sandler's strongest response isn't simply about defending a movie, a performance, or a career. It's about defending something much bigger. The idea that happiness doesn't need the approval of critics to have value. And once that argument takes center stage, the entire conversation changes. For Adam Sandler, an interview like this should have been routine. After decades in Hollywood, Sandler had already experienced nearly every kind of reaction a performer can receive. Some critics praised him. Others dismissed his comedy as immature. Some audiences considered his movies guilty pleasures, while millions of others simply enjoyed them without worrying about whether a critic approved. That was the strange thing about Sandler's career. He never seemed particularly interested in convincing everyone that his movies were sophisticated. He understood something much simpler. People wanted to laugh. They wanted to spend a couple of hours forgetting about work, school, bills, arguments, disappointments, and everything else waiting for them outside the theater or their living rooms. And Sandler had built an extraordinary career around giving them exactly that. But beneath the comedy was another side of his career that critics sometimes overlooked. He had also taken on dramatic roles that challenged the assumption that he could only play one kind of character. So when he arrived for a promotional interview, the expectation was simple. Discuss his latest work, talk about his career, maybe share a few funny stories, and move on. Instead, the conversation quickly began moving in a completely different direction. Behar's questions became increasingly pointed. At first, they could still be interpreted as tough entertainment questions. That's part of what makes a television interview interesting. A host isn't supposed to simply praise every guest who walks through the door. But there is a psychological difference between challenging someone and cornering them. A challenging question gives a person room to explain themselves. A hostile question assumes the answer before the person even speaks. And as the conversation continued, Sandler appeared to realize that he wasn't being asked to explain his career. He was being asked to justify it. Why did his style of comedy matter? Why should audiences take his dramatic work seriously? And perhaps most importantly, why should anyone consider laughter itself a meaningful contribution? Those questions hit something deeper than a simple disagreement about movies. Because Sandler's career had always existed in that uncomfortable space between critical approval and public affection. He had heard the arguments before. Too silly, too predictable, too juvenile, too commercial. But there was another side to the story that couldn't be measured by a review score. There were people who watched his movies with their families. People who turned them on after exhausting days because they wanted something uncomplicated. People who associated certain movies with childhood memories, friendships, parents, siblings, or moments when life felt easier. That raised a question that neither side could avoid. If something makes millions of people genuinely happy, does it automatically become less valuable because a critic doesn't consider it sophisticated? Sandler appeared determined to make his answer clear. He wasn't claiming that every movie he had ever made was perfect. He wasn't demanding that everyone love his work. He was defending something much more personal. The right to create something simply because it brings people joy. And that distinction would become the heart of the confrontation. Because the longer Joy pushed, the less the conversation seemed to be about one actor or one movie. It was becoming a battle over what entertainment is supposed to accomplish. Is art only valuable when it challenges people? Or can making someone laugh, even for a few minutes, be meaningful in its own right? Sandler had spent years answering that question through his work. Now, sitting across from Joy Behar, he was being forced to answer it with words. And for the first time, the easygoing comedian seemed ready to explain exactly why he had never been ashamed of making people laugh. The conversation began innocently enough. At least, that's how it appeared. Adam Sandler was sitting comfortably, talking about his career and the new direction his work had taken. He had been in Hollywood long enough to know that promotional interviews followed a familiar formula. The host asks about the project. The guest talks about the experience. There might be a joke or two. Then everyone moves on. But Joy Behar didn't seem interested in following the usual script. Her first serious question focused on Sandler's move into dramatic acting. On the surface, it was a reasonable topic. After all, Sandler had spent much of his career being associated with broad comedy. When an actor known primarily for making audiences laugh begins taking on heavier roles, people naturally become curious. But the way the question was framed changed everything. Instead of asking Sandler what attracted him to dramatic roles, the question carried an implication. Was he moving into serious acting because his comedy career was losing its power? It was subtle, and that's exactly what made it effective. A direct insult can be rejected immediately, but an implication forces the person being questioned to defend something they may never have intended to defend in the first place. Sandler initially didn't take the bait. He explained that exploring different types of stories was simply part of being an actor. There was no anger in his response. No dramatic speech. No attempt to attack anyone. Just a calm explanation. But Joy didn't let the subject go. The discussion shifted toward his previous comedies. Were they successful enough? Did critics respect them? Had Sandler been relying on the same formula for too long? Each question seemed to move a little further away from the movie he had actually come to promote. And that is where the psychological tension began. Because Sandler wasn't being criticized for one performance. His entire creative identity was being placed on trial. For someone who had spent decades hearing jokes about his movies, this probably wasn't unfamiliar territory. But there is a difference between hearing criticism and being publicly challenged to defend your right to succeed. Sandler remained composed. He pointed out that his audience connected with his work. That mattered to him. Not everyone had to enjoy every movie. Not every critic had to approve. But millions of people had chosen to watch his films. That audience was real. And their enjoyment was real. It was a simple argument, yet it contained something powerful. Sandler wasn't trying to prove that every critic was wrong. He was saying that critics weren't the only people whose opinions mattered. Joy's response pushed the conversation further. The implication was that popularity could not automatically be confused with quality. And technically, that was true. A movie can be popular without being considered great art. But Sandler's argument wasn't really about whether popularity equals artistic excellence. It was about whether popularity should make something worthless. And those are two completely different questions. That distinction would become increasingly important as the conversation continued. Because Sandler didn't need to prove that every movie he had made was a masterpiece. He only needed to establish one point. People enjoyed them. And if millions of people found laughter, comfort, or connection through those movies, then dismissing them as meaningless simply because they weren't prestigious missed something important about entertainment. The atmosphere began changing. What had started as a normal interview was becoming a philosophical disagreement. One side was asking whether an artist should constantly prove that their work has substance. The other was asking why entertainment needed permission to be valuable. Sandler still hadn't lost his temper. In fact, that was what made the moment more interesting. He was listening. He was answering. He was giving Joy every opportunity to make her point. But beneath that calm exterior, something was beginning to shift. Because there comes a moment in almost every confrontation when a person realizes that explaining themselves isn't working. The other side isn't asking questions to understand. They're asking questions to win. And when Sandler appeared to recognize that possibility, his demeanor changed ever so slightly. The smile became less frequent. The answers became shorter. and the patience that had defined his side of the conversation began to look less like comfort and more like restraint. The first shot had been fired. Sandler hadn't fired back. Not yet. But the interview was no longer simply about a new movie. It was becoming a question of whether one of Hollywood's most recognizable comedians would allow someone else to define the value of his entire career. And that question was about to become much harder to avoid. The conversation had already become uncomfortable. But the real shift happened when the criticism stopped being about one movie and started becoming a criticism of comedy itself. Joy's questions now seemed to suggest that Adam Sandler's success was built on something too simple, too childish, and too easy to deserve serious respect. That was a different kind of attack. Sandler could accept someone saying they didn't like one of his movies. He could accept a bad review. He could even laugh when critics made fun of his career. But questioning the value of comedy itself touched something much deeper. Because comedy was not simply a job for Sandler. It was the foundation of everything he had built. For years, audiences had watched him turn ordinary situations into ridiculous ones. They had laughed at characters who were awkward, immature, confused, exaggerated, and sometimes completely absurd. Critics could call that lowbrow. But audiences kept showing up. And that raised a difficult question. Why should something automatically be considered inferior simply because it makes people laugh? Joy appeared to approach the issue from a different perspective. From that point of view, entertainment should challenge people. Artists should push boundaries, explore serious ideas, and leave audiences thinking about something larger than themselves. And there was nothing inherently wrong with that argument. The problem was what happened when that standard became a judgment against everyone who chose another path. Sandler wasn't claiming that comedy was superior to serious drama. He wasn't saying every joke was profound. He was saying that people shouldn't have to defend themselves for enjoying something simple. That distinction mattered. Because sometimes people don't watch a comedy because they want to analyze society. They watch because they've had a terrible day. They watch because they're exhausted. They watch because their family is sitting together. They watch because for 2 hours, they want to forget whatever is bothering them. And sometimes that's enough. Imagine someone coming home after a long, stressful day. They don't necessarily want a complicated philosophical experience. They may just want to laugh. They want something familiar, something harmless, something that gives their mind a break. That's where Sandler's argument becomes psychologically powerful. Laughter isn't always about intelligence. Sometimes it's about relief. Sometimes it's about connection. Sometimes it's simply about giving the brain permission to stop worrying for a moment. And when someone dismisses that experience as meaningless, they aren't merely criticizing a movie. They can unintentionally make the people who enjoy it feel as though their own taste is somehow embarrassing. That was the line Sandler seemed unwilling to cross. He didn't need to convince Joy that his comedy was sophisticated. He only needed to defend the people who enjoyed it. And that changed the emotional center of the discussion. Suddenly, Sandler wasn't speaking only for himself. He was speaking for the audience. For the people who had grown up watching his movies. For families who had laughed together. For people who had found comfort in a familiar comedy during difficult moments. For anyone who had ever been told that the things they enjoyed weren't intelligent enough. And that is why his response became increasingly firm. He could accept criticism. What he seemed less willing to accept was contempt. There is a psychological difference between saying, "This isn't for me," and saying, "Anyone who enjoys this must have poor taste." The first expresses a personal preference. The second attacks the audience. And once the audience becomes part of the argument, the conversation becomes much more emotional. Sandler's calm expression began to disappear. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't insulting anyone. But his answers carried more weight. He began emphasizing the people who paid to watch his movies. The people who laughed. The people who returned for another movie. The people who didn't care whether a critic considered their entertainment sophisticated. They simply enjoyed it. And Sandler seemed to be making a larger point. Entertainment doesn't always need to educate you. Sometimes it needs to give you a reason to smile. That doesn't make it the greatest art ever created. It simply makes it useful. And usefulness can take many forms. A serious film can make someone think. A documentary can teach someone something. A song can bring back a memory. And a comedy can make someone laugh when they desperately need it. All of those experiences can matter. The room was beginning to feel different now. The discussion was no longer just about Adam Sandler. It was about a much bigger cultural argument that has existed for decades. Who decides what counts as meaningful entertainment? Critics? Artists? Executives? Or the people sitting at home deciding what they want to watch? Sandler appeared to have made his choice. He wasn't going to demand that everyone love his work. He wasn't going to pretend every movie was perfect. He wasn't even asking for universal respect. He was asking for something much simpler. Let people enjoy what makes them happy. And as joy continued pressing him, Sandler's patience was beginning to reach its limit. Because the more she attacked his comedy, the more obvious it became that this conversation wasn't going to end with a polite disagreement. Something bigger was coming, and Sandler was finally beginning to prepare for it. The conversation had already moved far beyond the movie Adam Sandler had originally come to discuss. But then came the criticism that struck at a completely different part of his career: his acting. For years, Sandler had lived with a strange contradiction. The same performer who could make audiences laugh with deliberately ridiculous characters had also shown that he could step into much darker and more complicated roles. But whenever an actor becomes associated with one particular image, escaping that image can be incredibly difficult. Once audiences decide who you are, every attempt to become something else can be treated with suspicion. And Sandler appeared to be facing exactly that problem. Joy's questions increasingly suggested that his dramatic performances weren't evidence of growth. They were simply another version of the same comedian audiences already knew. The implication was clear. Maybe Sandler wasn't really a serious actor. Maybe he was simply wearing a different costume. For someone who had spent years taking creative risks, that accusation carried weight. Sandler didn't immediately become defensive. Instead, he tried to explain why dramatic roles interested him. Comedy and drama, he argued, weren't necessarily opposites. In fact, they often required many of the same skills. Both depend on timing. Both require emotional control. Both require an actor to understand what the audience is feeling. And sometimes the most difficult performances are the ones where the actor has to stop trying to make people laugh. Sandler had learned that over time. He had discovered that audiences could see him differently when the jokes disappeared. The problem was that some people had already decided what he was. A comedian. A funny guy. The actor who made silly movies. And once that label becomes attached to someone, changing people's minds can be harder than earning success in the first place. This is where the psychological tension became especially important. Imagine spending years building a career, only to hear someone reduce the entire thing to one stereotype. It doesn't matter how many different roles you've played. It doesn't matter how many risks you've taken. Someone can still look at you and say, "You're not serious." That kind of statement doesn't criticize a performance. It questions identity. And identity is where criticism becomes personal. Sandler's response began shifting accordingly. He wasn't trying to prove that he deserved to be called a great dramatic actor. He was challenging the assumption that anyone else had the authority to decide what kind of actor he was allowed to become. That's an important distinction. An artist doesn't have to abandon one part of themselves to explore another. A comedian can perform drama. A dramatic actor can perform comedy. A musician can change genres. A writer can completely reinvent their style. Creative growth doesn't always mean destroying your past. Sometimes it means expanding beyond it. And Sandler's career represented exactly that kind of expansion. But Joy continued questioning whether his dramatic work had actually changed anything. The criticism suggested that serious acting required a certain kind of image. Perhaps a performer needed prestige. Perhaps critics needed to approve. Perhaps audiences needed to stop associating the actor with comedy. Sandler seemed to reject that entire premise. Why should a comedian have to prove that he is serious before being allowed to perform serious material? Why can't someone who has spent years making people laugh also have something deeper to say? And perhaps the most important question: why does being funny make someone less capable of being thoughtful? There was something almost ironic about the situation. The very quality that had made Sandler famous was now being used as evidence against him. His popularity became a reason to doubt him. His comedy became a reason to dismiss him. His success became a reason to question whether he had earned respect. But Sandler appeared to understand something his critics sometimes overlooked. Success doesn't erase artistic ambition. An artist can be commercially successful and still want to experiment. An entertainer can make simple movies and still care deeply about the craft. And a comedian can make millions of people laugh while also wanting to explore pain, grief, relationships, loneliness, or loss. The categories aren't mutually exclusive. That was the point Sandler was slowly moving toward. He wasn't asking Joy to praise every role he had played. He wasn't demanding that she call him a genius.